Hello, Father's Faithful. Thank you for joining me for Sunday School today. I read something in the book of Genesis this week, something that I'd read before. I'd read the story of Joseph and knew about his life and his brothers and how they betrayed him. But I read something in the scripture this week that stuck out to me. And basically, what it was saying, and I'm going to read the scripture to you so you'll hear it exactly like it is. But basically, what I read was, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Now, I know you've heard that before. Maybe you've even thought about that or said that before. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Let's read the scripture, Genesis chapter 50, verses 15 through 21. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph, saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Now, I want you to think about this for a minute. Joseph was not betrayed by strangers. Joseph was betrayed by his family. They were the men who had shared his childhood, they shared his home, they shared his bloodline, and one day they got mad at him and they stripped him of his robe, the robe that his father had made especially for Joseph, just to show him how much he loved him, and they threw him into a pit. Genesis 37 tells us that the pit had no water, but you still can imagine how Joseph must have felt. He was a young man, a teenager perhaps, and he was scared. Later, Scripture does tell us what happened. Genesis 42:21 records the brothers saying this, "We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life." So Joseph begged them to get him out of that pit, not to do the thing that they planned to do to him. He cried out to the very, very people who should have been protecting him. And they sat down and ate and left him in the pit. You know, betrayal like that doesn't just hurt. It rewires how you trust and how you hope and even maybe how you see yourself. And then there was Reuben, the oldest brother, the one with the responsibility of taking care of the younger brothers. Genesis 37:21 and 22 tells us that Reuben had planned to go back and get Joseph out of that pit. But he didn't. For some reason, he hesitated, he waited, and that turned into regret that Reuben would have for the rest of his life. Because when Reuben had returned and found that Joseph was gone, Scripture says he tore his clothes. That's Genesis 37:29. That is the grief of a man who knows that he has failed. And years later, Reuben is still haunted by the fact that he didn't get Joseph out of that pit. Genesis 42:22 says, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy?" And that wasn't Reuben expressing his anger, but it was him expressing his guilt that never had healed. Some regrets never fade away. Maybe they get quieter as time goes on, but they never completely fade away. And then there was Jacob, Joseph's dad. The brothers bring Joseph's robe back to him, soaked in blood, and he is sure that his son has died. Genesis 37, 34, and 35 says this: Jacob tore his clothes and mourned for his son many days. And then he said, I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave. Years ago, I watched my soul sister and her husband lose a child, and I can say that there is no pain that I have experienced in my life that can compare to that pain. That pain that I witnessed, that I lived with as I was friends with this precious lady and her husband. It interrupts time. It defies all logic. You can't explain why things like that happen. It leaves an empty chair that's never, ever filled. And as Jacob lost Joseph, believing that he had died, he refused to be comforted. We had a lesson on this a few weeks ago. The Bible didn't criticize Jacob for that. It gave him time to grieve, and that was all he could do at that time. But when we think back about Joseph, Joseph lost his freedom completely. He lost more than his freedom, though. He lost his family, he lost his name, he lost his future as he had understood that it was going to be, and he becomes a servant instead. He became a prisoner. He even became forgotten, if you remember the story of Joseph. And yet somehow Joseph does not allow that bitterness to become his God. And that probably didn't happen overnight. We don't really know when Joseph forgave his brothers for what they did to him. But forgiveness is often born from years of wrestling with something like that when you've been betrayed. So God was with Joseph. Genesis 39 tells us that. God didn't remove Joseph from suffering. He suffered many, many times and for many, many years. But God met him inside that suffering. You know, some of you may have lived similar lives. You know family betrayal. You know regret that just won't let go. You know the ache of loss. Perhaps it was the ache of losing a child or a sibling or a parent. We know that ache just recently as we lost our dear precious mother. And every single day I look around and I think about Mama and I see things that remind me of Mama and I miss her so much. But we also are rejoicing to know that she didn't have to lay and suffer for a long, long time. And she's now rejoicing in the arms of Jesus. And what more could we want for our dear mother? Maybe you are sad about the loss of the family that you might have someday. But if any of these things are you, then just listen very, very closely, because this lesson is not asking you to minimize your pain. It's not asking you to hurry your forgiveness, and it's sure not suggesting that grief just disappears if your faith is strong enough. Joseph's words came to his brothers after many, many years, not just moments. So God is very, very patient, sometimes all the time, with our wounded hearts. So if we fast forward to Genesis 50, we read now that Jacob is dead, and suddenly the brothers are afraid. And they say in Genesis 50:15, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? You know, guilt always expects punishment. So they send this message to Joseph asking him to forgive them. Maybe it was a sincere question to Joseph. Maybe it was just a desperate question. We don't know. But we know what Joseph's reaction was. And that was he wept. Not because his plan was to seek revenge, but because they still don't understand his heart. They don't really know Joseph. But Joseph responds with one of the most important questions that he could possibly ask, and that is this in Genesis 50:19. Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Joseph, at that moment, refused to play God. Revenge is always an attempt to take the place of God, to act as God. And forgiveness is an act of trust that God will do what we can't do on our own. So when Joseph finally stands before his brothers in Genesis 50, he's not speaking as a naive man. He's speaking as someone who knows betrayal. He knows regret. He knows relief. He knows loss. And that's why his words carry such holy weight. Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Joseph is saying, I will not define my life by what you did to me. And I will not let this pain have the final word. And I will trust God with the things that I can't undo. And from that place, that deep, scarred place, he speaks the truth that still carries us today. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. Genesis 50:20. Joseph did not deny their sin. He makes it very clear. He says, you meant this for evil. But he also recognized that somebody greater than him was at work in his life. God didn't cause that evil. God redeemed that evil. And we see this pattern again and again in the Bible. We look at Job and we see when Satan intended for destruction in his life, God used it for revelation. We see Moses rejected and exiled, and yet God was preparing him to be a deliverer. We see David hunted like prey, and yet anointed king. And we see Jesus betrayed and crucified, and yet victorious. Acts 2:23 says, this man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge. The cross proves once and for all that God can bring life out of death. So Joseph doesn't just forgive either. Genesis 50:21 says, so then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. So this forgiveness becomes provision, and that's grace. Some of you may still be living before your Genesis 50 moment. You may not be able to say yet, God meant it all for good. Well, that's okay. Faith doesn't require you to see the whole picture because you can't see the whole picture. It only requires you to trust the God who can see the whole picture, the God who holds your life in his hands. If you carry family wounds, know this. God sees what others may have dismissed, and God remembers what others may have forgotten. And if you carry loss, know this. Your grief has not gone unnoticed, and your tears are not wasted. Joseph's story reminds us that God is not finished, even when that pit seems final. And even when the answers don't come, the truth remains that you are not forgotten. You are not alone. And God is still at work, quietly, patiently, faithfully, doing only what God can do. I want to thank you for the prayers for our family this week. I mentioned in the lesson the passing of our mother, and we miss her every day. And we are sustaining because we are living and breathing and getting along because of your prayers, and we know that, and we thank you for that. I'm praying for your families. I know some of you have also experienced loss. Some of you are going through deep, deep sorrow, and and pain and sickness, and we're praying for you too. Thank you for listening. It's good to have a lesson. We've missed church for a couple of Sundays, but we'll be back at church on Sunday, 9:40. No, I say that wrong every time. 9:15 Sunday school and 10 o'clock worship service at Bethel. So you are welcome anytime. I'll see you next week, Lord willing. Hope you have a wonderful week. Thank you for listening.